host of Stan the History Man. And we like to talk about lesser known facts and ideas and so on of history. And Ukraine is certainly in the news these days. Will there be a war in Ukraine or whatever? So I want to talk about Ukraine. And one of the things that's very distinguished in or distinguishes this whole area, borderlands are sometimes called, is that a lack of natural barriers of any size. I mean, what's the difference between France? How can you tell the difference between France and Spain? Well, you got the Pyrenees, and there's quite a bit of different life on one side or the other, or France and England, or France and Germany, the Rhine River and the English Channel, or the French call it the Manche. They don't like the idea of the English Channel, the name, the English Channel. And so it's hard to tell where, let's say, Germany ends and Poland begins. It's convenient for the Germans to invade Poland, of course, several times. Um, it's hard to tell where Poland ends and Ukraine begins. Ukraine ends and Russia begins. And so what this means is there's a lot of back and forth between these areas over the years. And people would migrate from one side to the other. There have been a lot of intermarriages between Poles and Ukrainians, even they're fighting all the time, and Russians. And so that's, excuse me, that is what's happening in Ukraine, in the eastern Ukraine. The Russians made a definite policy, especially under the Soviet system, to put as many Russians in there as possible. And there wasn't that much difference in the language and so on. So it wasn't like they were deporting people from the Soviet Union to Ukraine. But this is what Stalin's idea was, to make Ukraine less Ukraine. He did the same thing with the Baltic states of Lithuania, Latvia, and Estonia. A lot of Russians there. And what's happening, of course, is many of the Ukraine, of course, resent the presence of the Russians there. And there's certainly a long history of hatred and violence between the Russians and the Ukraine. Don't call it the Ukraine anymore. It's just Ukraine as a sovereign state. And I do want to trace it briefly from actually when Putin, the Soviet dictator or Russian dictator, said that they're very close, the Ukrainians and the Russians. They aren't. Okay, the language is different. They have their own Orthodox Church or Roman Catholicism. And for many years, of course, Ukraine had been ruled by Russia. It was a province in Russia. And it was known as the breadbasket of Europe because the flat plain land of the steppe of Ukraine was a major competitor rather, with the United States and Canada, and used to say, if there's a bad harvest in Ukraine, every barn in Kansas gets a new coat of paint, see, because they were world competitors. Oddly enough, though, after the Russian Revolution, the Soviet Revolution, Russia was importing grain. And that's like talking about carrying coals to Newcastle. And one of the excuses that the Soviet government used when they said, well, how come you people have to import grain? Bad weather. So I guess the weather has always been bad. Was always bad in the Soviet Union from 1917 till what nowadays, I don't know for sure. In fact, what Stalin did was export grain, the Ukraine grain, to buy machinery and so on to modernize and industrialize Russia, which was Stalin's major thing. It wasn't to conquer the world or make it Soviet, which is, okay, it's nice, but to build up the Soviet Union as a modern state. Now, okay, Ukraine gets its independence, pretty well proclaims itself in 1918. And there are major wars over these borders, which hardly exist, between Ukraine, Poland, and the new Soviet Union. And when things are finally settled, then Ukraine does become a part of the Soviet Union. I'm not quite sure how they did it, but they became a part of the Soviet Union. And that's bad news for the Ukraine, because in 1930, they had the brilliant idea of, let's sort of modernize, we will collectivize our agriculture. They didn't like the idea of small peasants who felt like, this is my land, okay? They don't like that. Nobody should own anything really, except, the clothes on their back and maybe some tobacco or something. So they went in there and they said, we're going to combine all these farms, or as many as we can really, practically into big collective farms, and they'll be run with modern machinery, something that, of course, the peasants can't have. So it sounds like a great idea in the abstract, but it failed miserably. The peasants said, "This is my land. You can't come and just take everything away." They said, "Yes, we will. And if you don't like it, we'll send you to the gulag, or we'll shoot you, or we'll just let you die in the winter." And they figure, who knows for sure, when statistics in Russia, 5 to 10 million peasants starved to death. They were reduced to cannibalism. All right. Remember, peace, land, and bread was the promise of the Communist Party. And even Stalin, when Churchill brought the subject up during World War II to Stalin, tell me what do you think? What happened there? Stalin held up 10 fingers. And, if Stalin says 10, was it 20? But at any rate, it was in sort of lasting bitterness because of the Holodomor. They have Ukrainians have a special name for it, the Holodomor, when people starved to death. Deliberate policy. I mean, there aren't too many cases where they go and just want to starve people to death. But that's basically Russian policy. I get to them and say we want to starve them to death, but they better collectivize. They don't collectivize, we'll let the SOBs starve. So that has never been forgotten in Ukraine, and it shouldn't be. Well, in World War II, the German army glommed through in the early days of Russia, through Ukraine and into Russia. Of course, Ukraine, the province of Ukraine, the Ukraine as it was called then, was divided between Hitler and Stalin. The non-aggression treaty, what really discombobulated the communists. They're faithful, down with Hitler. He's a fascist, imperialistic monster. And then when they signed the treaty, oh, it's okay. Our main problem is imperialism and capitalism. And a lot of comrades got caught flat-footed. It's literally true. And one day, the daily worker is saying, "Down with the fascist beast," and the next day, it's Stalin. Stalin's not such a bad guy. And Hitler, of course, didn't plan to keep this at all. Stalin, in one of the most examples of self-delusion you can find in history, said, Hitler is not going to invade for the next 3 or 4 years or whatever. And so he bent over backwards to show his goodwill and good intentions to the Nazis. In fact, I tried to remark to a British communist historian that, your cities were bombed by airplanes fueled with Soviet aviation fuel in that period between the Hitler-Stalin Pact and the invasion of the Ukraine and the Soviet Union. As a matter of fact, as you probably well know, that the Nazis got as far as the gates of Moscow before they were stopped. Well, many Ukrainians finally, at first they welcomed the Germans. Look, if you're anti-communist, anti-Stalin, you must be doing something right. But again, a stupidity thing that Hitler said, no fraternization. They would accept them as laborers and so on, but with no fraternization. And so, again, many of them starved, during World War II. And after the war, of course, the Ukraine was brought back a part of the Soviet Union, and many Ukrainians were deported or killed for supposedly, sometimes truly and not, collaborating with the Germans. Well, the last thing I want to talk about in Ukraine is that the taking over of Crimea from the Ukraine, it was in the Ukraine, sorry. But I have to say a decent word for the Soviets, because they're not taking over an independent country. Crimea, the Crimea was a part of the Ukraine in 1954. So in a sense, they were just changing borders in one of the provinces of the Soviet Union. Of course, with the fall of the wall, a happy day. And I really wish we could celebrate the fall of the wall sort of like VJ Day or VE Day, celebrate and remember it, okay? But at any rate, then, of course, the Ukraine didn't waste any time to call itself Ukraine and an independent country. And the Soviets had to agree with that. But as I say, there's a long history. And what you have, of course, is many Russians living in eastern Ukraine. And a lot of them sort of agree with Putin that the fall of the Soviet Union was a bad thing. And I don't know why they think that, but they do. They want to see that that part of the Ukraine, which they had settled in would become part of Russia. And Putin really wants to get back practically everything that the Soviet Union had lost when the wall came down. But then that is the basis for the Russians' incursion into Ukraine, and the Ukrainians very determined, resistant to stop them. The Ukrainians have made it very clear that they will resist Russians to the utmost because they say we're not Russians, we're Ukrainians, and that's a big difference. I just want to point that out. The background of the porous borders of the Russians' halfway successful attempt to inundate the countries around them, and the hatred, and of course the great the Holodomor that the Ukrainians suffered in the 1930s. It's kind of like everybody suffered in the 1930s, but none worse than Ukrainians. Well, that's the episode for today. I'm Stan Histerman, and thank you. I would like to have you tune in again next time we have a little some Stan Histerman insights into history. Thank you for watching.